Thank you for joining us today. My name is Neerja Bharti, and I'm a Sloan alum and also one of the panel captains for the panel, The Owner's Guide to Platform Strategies. It's my pleasure to introduce moderator for this panel, Professor Marshall van Alstyne. Professor Marshall is one of the world's foremost experts on platform strategies and network business models. He is also a research scientist at MIT. He has recently published his book, Platform Revolutions. I'm sure he will talk a little bit more about it. So please welcome Professor Marshall. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to have you join us and see if we can introduce a couple ideas on platform strategies and how things are different. I want to start for introducing some absolutely fantastic panelists from Samsung, from edX, Deloitte, and Uber. What I'd like to do is just give you some facts to suggest precisely how things are different. I want to start with just a simple example. In 2007, 7 firms controlled 99% market share in the handset market, and they're really name brands. They're Nokia, Samsung, Sony Ericsson, Motorola, LG, and of course, BlackBerry. So this is you'd think that this was an incredibly well-protected market, because by the traditional elements of strategy, they had all the barriers to entry that you might expect. So if you look up here, they had economies of scale, large production. They had very famous brands across Nokia and BlackBerry and Samsung and others, world-class logistics, global sales channels. Over its existence, Nokia alone had invested $40 billion in R&D. You'd think these markets would have been unassailable. What's fascinating is that in only 6 years, that had transitioned, and a newcomer controlled 92% of industry profits. Apple hadn't even been on the roadmap. All the others at that time made 0 or negative profits, Samsung being the one exception. The question I ask to you, is it likely that all of the 7 incumbents had poor execution capabilities and clueless management? Probably not. Really, something had changed. What did that something be? To give you another illustration of some of the data as to why I think things have changed so much in these platform versus product business models, take a look at just some of the facts. How many of you know that BMW is now less valuable in the capital markets than Uber? BMW founded a century ago, in 1916, 116,000 employees with resources all over the world, valued at $53 billion, while the private equity markets are valuing Uber at $60 billion. We're going to ask Chris Taylor from Uber about that in just a moment. Or consider Marriott. Founded in 1927, 200,000 employees, $17 billion, compared to Airbnb, founded in 2008, with only 3,000 employees, now is valued at $21 billion. Or Walt Disney, founded in 1923, almost half the value of Facebook, where you and I create the content as opposed to professional designers and professional contractors. My last example is really one of the most interesting because it's truly an industrial era company. Kodak, founded in 1888, in its heyday, had 145,000 employees, was worth $30 billion, and yet Instagram, sharing and producing of photographs, was acquired for $1 billion when it had only 13 employees. Really, something is different. The rules of strategy have changed. I want to suggest that a couple of those things are different. One of them is that traditional products had supply economies of scale, where in the new internet business models, it's demand economies of scale, also called network effects. It's users creating value for users. Or another insight in the traditional strategy literature was walling things off, creating barriers to entry for the competition. The exact opposite is true in the internet business models or platforms, where we want permissionless entry. We want as many riders and drivers on Uber as possible, as many hosts and guests on on Airbnb as possible. We want this permissionless entry of the producers and consumers of the ecosystem. Or if we look at other elements of it, is the innovation just done by the firm, or is it also done by the entire ecosystem? Is it open innovation? Is it the assets just controlled by the firm, or rather, is it the assets of the community? What is it that the community is bringing to the ecosystem as a whole? For those of you that are interested, you can actually get some more detail on that in Platform Revolution. This afternoon, we'll have a panel discuss some of the elements of strategy and how is it these firms succeed in the competition to establish these various platforms. So with that, I'd like to introduce to you a rather august panel. We can start with Chris Taylor from Uber. So Chris Taylor has had a pretty terrific background. He's the general manager of Uber Boston. He's also oversaw the growth of Uber in Chicago. He also managed before that some logistics for a large e-commerce company in Thailand. I don't know if you speak Thai or not. We'll have to press on that. Right. He also, before that, was consultant with Boston Consulting Group and also earned a degree from Harvard Business School, although at MIT we won't quite hold that against him. Quite an accomplishment. And prior degrees in math and social science and economics from Northwestern. Excellent background. I'd also like to introduce Sanjay Sarma, Vice President of Open Learning at MIT, also in charge of edX and OpenCourseWare. Many of you will know that we've opened the ecosystems here at MIT so that others can contribute, and there's a staggering open platform of content across a large number of universities, and Sanjay, as Vice President of Open Learning at MIT, is in charge of that. As another element of something most of you might be familiar, any of you familiar with an RFID chip? Use them? You should also know Sanjay was one of those that helped invent some of that technology. He's also looked at the business models of that and Internet of Things. So we're in a really fortuitous position to be able to ask him questions both about educational platforms and about IoT platforms going forward. I'd like to introduce George Collins. We're honored to have the CTO of Deloitte Digital with us today, who's able to talk about other firms that have been developing these platforms. He comes to us with a background and expertise in research and development, technology strategy, architecture, implementation, ERP systems, agile evangelism. University leads. George, you're in my seat. And also prior experience with Anderson Consulting, an excellent background from the University of Leeds. And finally, I'd like to introduce Eric McCarty, Vice President of Mobile Technology for Samsung, yet another of the products I'm sure that many of you carry today. An extraordinary set of technologies. He's in charge with the mobile development, Samsung B2B smartphone market, tablets, and wearable computing. He also has wonderful background to give you some of the interesting stories that we've spoken about previously in companies. BlackBerry RIM, he was with them previously, also with Sprint Nextel, also with Suncom Wireless, and also with AT&T Wireless. Quite a remarkable background in technology. Prior experience with Harvard Business School Executive Education and University of Richmond political science degree and background. So with that, let me introduce the panelists. And starting from one end to the other, if you take just a moment and speak to us about other things that we didn't mention in your biographical profile, please.
Yeah, well, I'm fortunate enough to work for a consulting firm, so we have the privilege of helping a lot of our clients realize their ambitions. So I got to see a wide variety of industries, from software, across technology, telco, transportation as a service, you name it, we're there, government, non-profit institutions. So consider myself pretty fortunate. I started off life actually as a software engineer with Oracle back in the day when Oracle was sexy. I don't know if that's still the case, but yeah, and I've progressed, from building solutions to helping clients build their own platforms. So.
Excellent, thank you.
Thanks, Marshall. So again, Eric McCarty, as Marshall pointed out, I look after mobile product marketing for our enterprise segment at Samsung, and have enjoyed the experience of working for a number of the big wireless operators as well. So that's been interesting translating into the product side. But really like the role that I'm in now, primarily because we're really driving Samsung more towards a platform type of approach versus a hardware-only type of approach, which is really where the company started out. I do this in rooms of people all the time, but just by show of hands, how many people know Samsung as a TV company? Almost everybody. How many people know what Samsung Knox is? A small handful of people. Okay, so we'll help with some of those understandings as we go throughout the day-to-day, but it all ties into what Marshall talked about really focusing on the platforms and driving that whole story for the customer.
Thank you. Sanjay.
Well, Marshall, you covered it very well, but I started my career actually on a platform, an oil platform. And it's sort of funny, when I look back on oil platforms, I was actually a schlumberger. You have the platform, you have a rig, you have the oil producing company, you have all the service providers that show up on the rig and exchange services. And since then, I've had this sort of interesting sort of changes in career from oil to education. I've done a bunch of startups, and it was very interesting. I met Marshall about a year and a half ago, and he gave me some of the words which are in his book now to explain a lot of my life and the way I've thought about things. So thank you, Marshall.
Oh, well, thanks for the book plug also. Thank you. And Chris, please.
Yeah, so I have had the privilege to be at Uber for the past little bit over 2 years. And in those 2 years when I joined, I was probably in the 800 or 900s in terms of number of people who were at the company when I joined. And just 2 years later, we're at probably nearly 7,000 people working for the company across the globe. So the scale and pace of growth at the company has been pretty incredible to be a part of. And I've also fortunately been able to see our growth and how we interact and change cities for the better, both while managing the Chicago business for 2 years, and then recently moving over to Boston and getting to manage Boston and the teams that oversee our broader New England portfolio. It's been a very, very fun adventure, and excited to share some of the lessons with you guys today.
Thank you. So Eric, I'd like to start with you, because so many different companies start as product companies, and Samsung's known for its products. How does Samsung make the transition to a platform company? What's happening with that? What are the benefits and the challenges in making that transition?
No, great question. Thanks, Marshall. So, and again, by the group in this room, just by raising your hands and talking about televisions or thinking about smartphones or thinking about a laptop or any type of device, that's how most people, for at least the last 10 plus years or so, have really recognized Samsung as a device manufacturer. And what we're really doing is changing that story to really focus on solutions and how all types of different devices can in fact be connected together in order to solve challenges or specific challenges within the line of business within our enterprise customer base. So that's a whole strategy that we have of pivoting to solutions and then pulling the hardware behind it. But that's been our focus in terms of moving from just hardware to really a true platform environment. And there are a couple of ways that we're really doing that. One is looking at security and having an entire security platform, an entire stack that protects data on a device and then up into the cloud. Another way is managing analytics, as an example, or creating an analytics management system for wearables devices. And then the third would be really looking at how we're managing virtual reality content and what you can do with that. So there's really multiple platform approaches that we're taking at this point, but it all ties back to really focusing on the solution at the end of the day, solving a line of business challenge for the enterprise customer, and then leveraging the Samsung hardware as the endpoint for that.
So picking up on the hardware and the security, one of the things you guys have built is Knox. So Knox, if I'm not mistaken, is your security platform?
Correct.
Now, a security platform is closed and partitioned as opposed to open. How are you using that, a closed and partitioned thing, to actually build an open ecosystem?
Great question. So the way we're managing security is starting from the hardware level, which is in fact very closed ecosystem. So from the minute you press the power button on a device, there are protection layers at the hardware level that are providing security for that device itself and for anything that exists on the device, such as making sure that the device loads the right operating system and then monitoring that operating system to make sure there's no tampering going on with that. Where the system has to become more open in order to be able to provide services and solutions to customers is once you go above that operating system layer, how then you expose a software development kit that allows different EMM or MDM or application providers to actually then write to the different types of APIs that tie back into the hooks on the device to create a unique experience for the customer. So it's really about the software development kit at that point and then exposing that to a range of partners in order to enable.
So that's at the technological layer. So again, this is still the product and technology. What about the content layer? Because I also understand Samsung was trying to get into content and virtual reality and things like that. So how are you using content to build the platform on top of the technology?
Another great question. So the content piece is absolutely critical, we feel, at least for our customers. So some of that's partnering as well with a number of different content developers or providers, particularly when we look at virtual reality as an example in our Gear VR product. This is also a function of a very open software development kit that allows content providers to write that content into the VR format. But we're also providing tools like different types of cameras and capabilities to film that so that you're creating a holistic experience, a holistic virtual reality experience for the customer at the end of the day. But the content is absolutely critical. Some of it we're focused on developing on our own, and we have a whole team of development folks out in California that are looking at that and using services such as Milk Video, which is something that Samsung created along with our Milk Music service. But we also realize that there are a lot of very specific needs when it comes to particularly education in the workplace, and that content has to be very specific to the end customer, which is why we take, again, that approach of exposing the software development kit and then supporting the development process and supporting the developers who want to actually go through that and build the content.
So I'm hoping we'll get to some of the content and education when we get to Sanjay in just a moment. One other thing I do want to ask about, many of you, I don't know if you've heard of the operating system Tizen. Tizen is now a competing operating system for mobile phones and watches, and one wonders why one would propose to build yet another operating system when even Microsoft has had a hard time making that work. So why Tizen, and how are you going to make that work in competition with these other mobile operating systems?
So Tizen actually is a great example of a way that we can really expand into new markets. So when we talk about the US market in particular, we're still very much focused on the Android operating system within the smartphone environment. And within a portion of the tablet environment, Microsoft makes up the rest of that now that we've launched a new Windows tablet 2-in-1 device as well. But in the wearable space, this is all Tizen today. In fact, in a lot of the IoT products that we're developing, including the Samsung Connect Auto product, which is our connected car solution, that's a Tizen-based solution as well. The good news is that we have the same security capabilities on top of Tizen that we've layered in on top of Android as well, minus the container type of solution where you separate the work and personal. That's very relevant to a device with a large screen, whereas a smaller screen or a device without any screen at all, you want to have some flexibility, and the Tizen operating system allows us that flexibility from a development perspective and from a deployment perspective.
Quickly, so what's the market share of Tizen relative to?
It's very, very low. Yeah, I mean, so in the US, it's just limited to our wearables devices. So we're talking about a fractional market share at this point.
So my last question is going to be, so you've got refrigerators, you've got TVs, you've got watches, you're connecting everything. How are you going to compete in the Internet of Things space, given there are so many standards? I love I don't know, any of you have seen the XKDC cartoon? So there are 13 standards, so we need one to integrate them all, so we get 14 standards, right? So how are you going to make yours the standard, or what's going to happen?
Another really good question, right? So we're in the process, and Internet of Things is relatively new from a Samsung perspective. We're approaching it from the angle of we've got all of these great hardware endpoints out there: refrigerators, televisions, monitors, displays, PCs, Chromebooks, laptops, the watches, the smartphones, the tablets, everything that can now connect to each other and then connect into other devices as well. So we're taking very much approach of how do we create a unique experience for the user across the different types of Samsung devices. A great example of that is the ability now to connect an Android smartphone directly to a Windows tablet. So crossing those operating systems. Same thing when you look at a wearable device connecting into an Android smartphone as well. So we're really bridging the gap between those different types of software to create a user experience that layers on top of that then becomes unique to those different pieces of hardware. So that's really the differentiator at the end of the day. Behind the scenes, there's a lot of partnering going on to make that happen.
Well, this make a great segue to turn to Sanjay. So here's someone who's actually built a lot of technology for RFID chips and things of that sort. So Sanjay, is the Internet of Things truly a platform?
You know, a lot of people say it's a platform. I don't think it's a platform. I think of the Internet of Things as a sort of a design language, right? I mean, it's a way to say things that you couldn't say 5 years ago, right? It's a way of saying, well, when I drive home, I want the heating to turn on when I'm within a mile. And you can sort of not sound silly when you say that now. So the IoT is not a standard. IoT is a series of capabilities that have been opened up by connectivity, by sensors, by actuators, by intelligence, and so on. IoT does have platforms embedded in it, such as the one you just described. But I also think that there isn't, frankly, a dominant one, and it'll take some time for the dominant one to emerge. And I have some guesses as to what it might be.
So let's take it a step further. What would make IoT into a platform? What would convert it so that it really became one?
To me, a platform is something that enables you to it's a design metaphor. A platform is where you go in and you can have folks come in from different sides and build value that accrues to both sides and sort of grows with the network, right? It means that we need to really conceptualize both the architecture and the standards and the design metaphors. If you'll take the World Wide Web, although it's not necessarily a platform, but it is, I guess, at some level. Before Tim Berners-Lee came along and said, we will have a page with a hyperlink. You have the internet, which is much more powerful. You could do TCP/IP, you could do all these other things, all these other protocols. And what Berners-Lee said was, we don't care about that stuff. Just a page and a hyperlink, right? And the moment he focused our attention on that, and we gave up on a lot of other things, because we focused on that, we made standards happen, HTML, now HTML5, all that stuff. And the entire ecosystem could work around that very simple design metaphor. With the Internet of Things, if I want to connect that bulb to that door, I might do it one way. If I want to connect the door to the air conditioner, I do it another way. What will happen, in my view, in the years ahead is a dominant design. And my guess for that is some of it will be in the cloud. I've ranted in the past about what I call avatars, the real world mimicked in the cloud. Sort of digital mirrors. And once that happens, and once you write code that sort of ties it all together, and if you can design a beautiful sort of way to do it, then you have a platform. But we don't have that yet. The closest I've seen is the Amazon Echo, which is not in the cloud, but in my view, they've absolutely nailed it in the home. And the other is IFTTT, if this, then that. So, but I haven't seen very many others. I don't know what the others think, but I think it's an open field.
So my dream would be that the Samsung smart refrigerator connects to the Echo and then automatically reorders my groceries as I deplete my refrigerator. And
well, you joke, right? But
you can do that.
I think Amazon has encouraged contractually a lot of the vendors to do auto replenishment.
Yeah, there's something called skills. They have all the stuff built in, so it turn into.
Yeah, I know MIT students reordering supplies or beer would be a wonderful element of that. So very, very much on target. So Sanjay, what would cause it to tip, given the possibility of competing standards, the possibility of competing elements of the platform? What would cause it to suddenly tip, gel, and take off?
I think that the good news, which is also the bad news, is the 13, 18 standards at the physical layer, right, at the network layer, the MAC layer. You have BLE, you have Wi-Fi, you have a Thread, you have just 6LoWPAN, and you have Zigbee and Z-Wave, and I can go on and on. So I think we should just give up on that. That ship has sailed, and we're going to have all those standards. And actually, some of them are better for certain applications. If you're on low power, you use one standard. If you're on low battery, we use another standard. And I think my view is what it'll take is our A, giving up on that fight instead of fighting it, and B, tunneling through those protocols and creating a sort of an avatar concept and really focusing on that and agreeing to how my avatar of a fridge talks to my avatar, of something else, right? And really sort of focusing on the semantics and the syntax of that. And that's missing. But once that happens, I think in this industry, to me, because we're unleashing some unbelievable capabilities, and because we have been such terrible, frankly, marshals for our own sort of society and for our planet, I think that there's huge opportunity to unleash with technology that can work together.
So speak to a different platform where you're actually making this happen. As vice president in charge of open systems, open courseware at MIT, how are you launching and building the educational platform space? So what's happening there?
It's a good question. So MIT's been in business for 150 years. Education as we know it, the university's been around, the Western university's been around for 1,000 years. Universities as we know them, going back to Pakistan and 700 BC, have been around for 2,700 years. They've all worked one way. You have professors, you have students, and professors teach students, right? So it was a shock in the 2011s when 3 new companies emerged. Coursera, Udacity, but close to our heart and something I'm very proud of, edX. What MIT and Harvard did was invest $30 million each, stand up a not-for-profit. And what it does is has 80 university partners that produce content and millions of students. We've had 23 million registrations from 196 countries. Students sign up for the content. The content is rich. It's not just videos. You can get assessed, you can take an exam, you can simulate a hurricane, and students get a rich learning experience. Not as good as being on campus, but it's pretty good. So much so that we've actually admitted students we've found through this platform. And so what it is we've taken education, we've disaggregated it, which is one of the tenets, one of the things that platforms often do. We've democratized it, we have scaled it, and we've provided value to both parties. We're in early days, but when we did it, people thought we were nuts, and they were probably right. But I think it's an extraordinary step in taking what has been exclusive, which is education, and making it inclusive.
So you described a couple of different platforms. There's edX, there's Coursera, there's Udacity. There are a couple of other startups in there. How many such platforms do you think there will be? And what will distinguish the more successful competitors?
Well, I'll sort of wave my flag here, and you'll see where my loyalties lie. For disclosure, I'm on the board of edX. But edX is a not-for-profit. It's the most important thing. It's not a for-profit. And in the history of higher education, high-quality higher education has always resided in the realm of not-for-profits. If you follow for example, the controversy, shall we say, around the University of Phoenix, right? The moment you get for-profit, eventually there's a shareholder, who's going to ask for returns. And that drives you in a certain direction. So my view is, and the other thing is, if you've taken $100 million in investment, you need to return a few $1 billion, right? Eventually. So the way we did it with edX is we said, forget that, let's focus on stakeholders, not shareholders. Let's also open source the edX platform. So it's been downloaded by hundreds of universities around the world, and they're using them. And the edX.org site is where sort of most of the action is. So my view is that's going to win, because we just need to be self-sustaining. We don't have to make $1 billion, but we can be focused on our mission as opposed to on money. And so that way we believe it'll be aligned. Now, to give you an example, Udacity started with similar lofty goals, for profit. Well, about 2 years ago they pivoted, and now they do professional education, basically vocational programming, things like that, right? You will not see a philosophy course on Udacity. And I suppose at some point Coursera is going to have to figure out where it stands in all this. But the good news of edX is we can have that philosophy course and we can really cherish it. So that's the way we're taking it on.
So let me politely press on this a little bit. If we have, give you another metaphor for the same thing. In operating systems, we have the free Linux operating system, and yet we now have highly successful Android and Apple, which are open but not open, and they have now taken over the vast majority of the market. So how does in that space, the free compete with the not for free as opposed to education?
That's a good and a tough question. Apple, of course, is based on BSD, Berkeley Systems Distribution, so it's a form of Unix. Of course, they have their own layer on top of it. Android is allegedly free, is it? I don't know. Slipped one in there. Anyway, I think that what Apple has done is really focused on the user experience and done a great job. But my view is education is just far more dynamic. You know, I mean, we're learning at such an incredible MIT, right? I mean, the things are changing so rapidly. Even what we're learning about how teaching should occur has changed in the last 5 years. In fact, we just launched a center at MIT, which, as a part of my organization, called an initiative called the MIT Integrated Learning Initiative. We're trying to figure out how the brain works, to change learning so that it can match the brain, which is something we've neglected to do for 1,000 years. So my view is it's very chaotic, and it's hard for a company to make a bet and be hopeful that the technology approach of that bet will survive the changes ahead in education.
Thank you. Well, the business model question would be a great question to then turn to George on this. So we can start with some of the business models on this. How is it that platforms are disrupting traditional businesses like universities, and how should these platforms make money? So disruption and making a buck.
Yeah, well, let me just segue back to the question you asked Sanjay real quick. So I think there's an interesting contrast between the Android and iOS and the Apple ecosystem that they've built around it and Linux. So I don't really think of Android and iOS and all the things that Apple does as free necessarily, but they've created a pretty free ecosystem and an environment. So if you're a developer, you're an independent software company, if you want to build around their platforms, you're pretty free to do so, within certain constraints. Linux, on the other hand, you can pretty much do what you like with it. Indeed, with FreeBSD, Apple created its own operating system and went with great strides on that. But there's only really one company that's made a commercial success out of Linux, right? So
right.
Red Hat, and we'll see what happens in the next 5 to 10 years there. So I do think, by definition, open source is kind of, it's a race to the commodity layer. And so the way that you make a commercial success out of it is to offer value on top of it. Now, what Red Hat's done is offer a whole framework of services. So if you take Red Hat versus Oracle, Linux, or whatever other distribution, you're doing it because you want to take advantage of the value they provide. So that, in a sense, is how someone is able to commercialize something that's open. As it relates to your question around platforms and disruption, I think my experience in consulting, 15 to 20 years. I mean, I got into it when companies and institutions and organizations were, really focused on their internal operation. They were focused on digitizing and transforming themselves internally. They hadn't, of course we had supply chains that connected partners, but they hadn't really looked outwardly. And by the way, at that time, everybody was focused on building products, aside from traditional services. That's fundamentally changed. Now, we're in a service-based economy. Anything that can be offered as a service is being offered as a service. It's being consumed on a service basis. It's being monetized. It's being billed for on a consumption basis. Take Uber as an example, and doing that, and doing it in that way, and creating a platform that allows you to connect to your customers and partners in a very engaging way, is creating fantastic experiences. Literally this week I heard a couple of people say, I love Uber. Now I will challenge anyone in this room to know someone who said that about their local taxi company. But Uber's been able to do it with an app, with a network, with its own proprietary technology, but it's been able to disrupt a very, very traditional, very closed industry. And you can take that example in almost every other industry. There's a platform, there's an ecosystem, there's a set of services that are being provided, and if you can do it quickly, if you can get to delivering value that's recognized, you're going to win.
Absolutely. So I actually want to pick up on something that George said. I think it's quite important. In order for these business models to succeed, You open around key control points, you don't open everything. If you open everything, there's no way to run a business. But if you open around key control points, it gives you a way to steer the ecosystem or to monetize the ecosystem. So you don't go free open everything. You have to have something that you charge for. So in your experience, because you've done this now for a while, and Deloitte's been pretty involved in this, which firms have built the most successful markets and most successful ecosystems, and are both of those the same thing in the platform terms? Is a market and ecosystem in which firms have done the best job of doing this?
They're not the same, but I think almost every market is going to have its share of ecosystems. We're pretty fortunate, in Deloitte Digital, where I sit, we're part of a much broader firm, and we get the luxury of kind of being selective about who we work with and what we work on. And like I say, at the top of the conversation, we're just lucky that we're able to help lots of clients realize their ambitions. So, speaking from a personal perspective, because I work in the software industry, I really like what Adobe has done, and I was kind of part of that journey in a couple of different areas. But when I got to Adobe, circa 2009, 2010, they were just on your desktop, right? They were a desktop software company. They shipped at the time CDs, DVDs. And now they're one of the leading cloud services companies. Well, they got 3 clouds, actually. But they're one of the leading software companies that have transitioned to the cloud. They've created an ecosystem around their 3 cloud offerings. They've got a marketplace. If you're a creative individual, you can monetize your assets, and you can take advantage of that network. So they've got a commerce play. They've got a creative play. I really like what they've done. Salesforce is another great example. Even Deloitte, as a services company, we build products on Force.com. They make it incredibly easy for developers, engineers to build products on their platform. So, I like a lot of what I'm seeing in my industry for sure.
So I love Salesforce as an example. They've done a very successful ecosystem play. They've really brought in a lot of third parties in that. So what challenges, if firms are making the transition, so some start new, Uber starts de novo, but a lot of firms don't start as platforms, they have to make the transition. What challenges do firms face in transitioning from product to platform? Or asked differently, what advice would you give Samsung?
A little backstory. I had the fortune to be part of the early part of the Tizen story, so I know a little bit about it, so I can kind of come back to that. But I think, change is hard. Change is really hard for a lot of companies. When you've got your bets being protected, and you've built an organization, you've built a network around a traditional product or a traditional offering or a traditional network or a traditional set of customers, moving away from that is really difficult. I'm privileged to be part of a CTO forum in the Valley, which is a pretty innovative place. Mm-hmm. And what I like there, which I'll share, and I think many companies do this, certainly the best ones do it, the CTOs or heads of innovation, these guys and girls, they have budgets protected, they have ring-fenced ability to go innovate, and what they're seeking to do actually is find ways to disrupt their own businesses. So they've got business units, they've got R&D functions and products. They're looking really at best the next 3 to 5 years. So the leading companies and the leading lights of innovation that I have the good fortune to speak with and meet with, they're looking at 5-10 year plus horizons. They're looking at ways to disrupt themselves before they themselves get disrupted. Okay. And like I say, they've got different metrics to the way they run these operations. They're not for profit, right? They're not looking at revenue plays. And if you're not going to disrupt yourselves, inevitably you will be disrupted. So like I said, that would be one thing I would share. And then back to who am I to offer Samsung advice? But I think the ecosystem play around, you mentioned the connected home. Again, we work with auto manufacturers. Everyone's talking about the connected driver, the connected vehicle, connected home, connected everything. So thinking about things beyond the scope of the device I think is one thing. You know, of course you got to start small, but really think big. Think about the main play, which is, you know, we're trying to digitize our lives. We're trying to digitize everything. And I think the analogy you made about the proxy to a physical device is a really, really good one. We're seeing that a little bit. I mean, you go check out RAML. There's some standards that are emerging around, you know, in that case, RESTful markup around resources. But you know, I would think about the broader ecosystem and then how devices and platforms play into that.
So let me give you a tiny bit of data to support some of these platform businesses. There's some recent research at Boston University that shows that companies that open APIs, as application programming interfaces, actually have higher sales and lower CapEx. So you get, in some sense, a double gain. It's a really neat bit of data. You've done some work in APIs. What are some lessons learned in externalizing the source of value creation? Can you give us one or two lessons learned from that? And then I want to make sure we get some time for Chris.
Yeah, I mean, a real kind of it sounds a little glib, but you know, starting small and then expanding, rather than trying to kind of service enable your entire business or entire organization, is a good way to start. So, you know, what are the key points? For example, you know, are you having a pain in exposing products to your ecosystem or sharing customer information? I mean, a lot of the companies that we work with have evolved their services plays so that they're using the same APIs to external parties as they're using to, you know, share information internally across applications or across organizational boundaries. So, you know, I think taking a kind of dispassionate view about who is the consumer of your API or your service and thinking about, you know, what business problem are you trying to solve?
Great, great. So Chris, can you get us all a coupon code to get this crowd to the pub?
I can.
Please tweet that out, please.
Yeah.
So, Chris, you've done some amazing stuff. I mean, just think of what Uber has done in the past, you know, couple of years. It's really, really quite remarkable. So, what are the benefits? Picking up on some of that, what are the benefits of running these online marketplaces, and what are the downsides? What are the challenges of running these online marketplaces?
Yeah, so I mean, if you think a lot of the broader on-demand economy that you'll often hear people say, the Uber for this, the Uber for this.
Yeah, it's nice to have them use your vocabulary for all of their businesses.
Exactly.
Well done.
But some of the incredible benefits of it are the speed to scale, the unlocking the potential of unutilized assets that exist around the world. So the CapEx investment needed for the company itself is much more focused on the technology and then bringing people into the platform on both sides, as opposed to necessarily purchasing large-scale assets on both sides. So the ability to scale very quickly is a huge benefit of that. And the speed with which you can change your product is another key advantage. We're not necessarily, you know, when you think about what Uber sells, we're not selling you or competing necessarily with a taxi ride. We're selling you the ability to get where you want to go. And so that competes and augments and supplements personal car ownership, a bicycle, shared bikes, public transit, taxis. So it allows us to modify our product to meet different needs incredibly rapidly in a way that would be really difficult if our business was constrained to just, for example, making cars.
So what are the downsides of running such a market? We hear all the successes. What's not working?
It's an interesting business to compete in. On the one hand, you could assume that barriers to entry are very low. But on the other hand, if you want to successfully build a sustainable platform, it can also be extremely expensive. You need to bring people into both sides of it. So in our business, we're certainly not the only game in town, particularly across the globe. And when you look at how you create a positive experience for people, you need the network effects. You need a large population of riders who want to participate. You need a large population of drivers who also want to provide rides. To start that out, if you're starting from behind, it's actually really expensive because someone else has a superior network effect where the riders are keeping the drivers busier, they're making more money. It's more attractive for a driver to join a platform that's dominant, and then it all just feeds itself. It's a very virtuous cycle. So playing from behind can be challenging.
So you highlight something that's actually really important, which is that although most folks might think the switching costs are really low, those network effects actually create that barrier to entry. So a driver might switch, but he's got to take the users with him. Or a user might switch, but he'd have to take the drivers with him. So that network effect creates its own switching costs or barrier to entry. It's a really neat property.
And that's the best defense, is providing the best service to both sides of the platform.
So how do you measure the health of each side of the platform? So you worry about defections and things. How do you measure that?
Yeah, so I mean, the key things we look for are just various metrics that tell us at the end of the day how good is the experience for the riders and the drivers on our platform. So we care very deeply that for a driver, we offer the best earning opportunity of any platform out there. And what's kind of funny about that is that actually means that not only are we competing against other rideshare platforms, but other companies like a DoorDash or any other Postmates, or I mean, frankly, like Domino's Pizza. I mean, any company that's offering someone the chance to, hop in their car and make extra income, that's really part of the marketplace that a driver can choose to come from. So we need to offer the best earning potential for those drivers. So we'll look at how busy are we keeping them? How much downtime do they have? How much are they making on average per trip or in an hour? And then from a rider side perspective, we also care very deeply that riders are having good experiences.
So how do you open a new market? You've done this in Chicago, you've done this. How do you open a new market? How do you keep the proportions inside? If you get too many drivers in there, they leave. They don't have anyone to go with. They have too many riders. So how do you open it, and how do you keep those proportions balanced?
No, that's exactly right. Keeping a tight link between the supply and demand in the platform and kind of a healthy tension is a really important part of growing and monitoring the business. When we first launch markets, you have to have drivers. If the first time a rider opens up the app, they don't see a car, you can lose them right from the first go. So you really do have to have the drivers. And then as you grow, it's a lot easier to add riders than it is to add drivers. Historically, when you look at our business, for the most part, we're supply constrained. And so our number one problem is always finding more people who want to get on the platform and drive.
So which industries are better fits for these kinds of markets, and which ones don't work?
Yeah, so I was thinking about this a lot as we were all talking and talking about BMW, talking about different companies that have successfully made a transition. And some companies have made that transition beautifully. So like if you look at Amazon, it didn't start out as a platform business. They had warehouses, they housed every good they sold. And if you thought about them selling literally everything in the world, it would have been hard to build warehouses to house everything. But then they opened up the marketplace, and you can buy things from other vendors through Amazon's portal. The third party will ship it to you, and you create this like really interesting place where they don't have to invest all of, I don't work for Amazon, so I'm probably getting parts of this wrong, but they've opened up availability to things that are much broader. It's a lot easier when you have a digital entry point, and the consumer doesn't necessarily feel the difference. Some manufacturing businesses are better fit for that. Most car companies are talking about being mobility companies, where they want to add access, shareability, things like that. But I mean, just honestly thinking about like all of us are sitting here wearing shoes, like it's pretty hard to think about how, like Sperry could become a platform company. Like I'm just not wrapping my head yet around how I go about getting like supply side, network effect about my shoes.
And a pair of shoes shows up.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, well, Sperry platform shoes will be fine.
Yeah, there we go.
There is a company in Chicago that has a little network of artists and designers that deliver their product to a shoot, right?
No, this is actually true, and there are t-shirt companies that do this as well. Threadless.com did some really cool stuff where user-generated content designing really phenomenal t-shirts that were super, super cool. So there are ways to do the design element of it. It's true. Yeah.
So here's a challenging question. Should Uber be worth more than BMW?
So this gets actually to the point where I think when you talk about the addressable market and what we're really going after, BMW is manufacturing cars. We are selling you mobility, and we're selling it to you globally. You can land in Beijing, Rio, SFO, I mean, name a city, you can land and get an Uber, same app, go where you need to go with incredible service and the same expectations. And when you actually look at most American households, transportation is probably the number 2 or 3 spend category for most people. After home ownership, you've basically got, housing, transportation, education, food, like those are the top spend categories. So if I can convince you to not buy a car and basically take Uber all the time, which is what I've been doing for the past 2 years, yeah, there's something there.
So something else is happening. I think most everyone in the audience knows that Uber has been making investments in self-driving vehicles. How is this industry going to change as you move away from a platform into a vertically integrated company and you start to own that side of the market?
I think the business models that are going to dictate the future of autonomous vehicles are going to be fascinating to watch, because part of what your question assumed was who owns the cars, who makes them, who owns the connection versus whatever it is between all of it. So I think there are probably a lot of different business models that are going to emerge, and it'll be really, really interesting to see where it goes.
We're supposed to find out what those are.
Yeah. No, obviously, it will be fun. There are a lot of companies looking at it. Ford's investing, Google's investing, Apple is supposedly investing, we're investing, Lyft and General Motors are investing. Everybody's looking at it.
So, no, please go, please.
Assuming you get the autonomous cars on the road, let's say in the US, do you think that you'll continue to manufacture, or do you see it more like you might license out what you've done, open out that to the established autos?
I have no idea, to be honest. I think at the point where the driving experience is not the defining part of getting somewhere, like a BMW is the ultimate driving machine. They sell you driving passion. And at the point where A to B becomes a commodity, who owns the value in that? In the value chain of mobility, is the value owned by the OEM that creates a box that gets you there? Is it controlled by the software because one dominant company invents the right algorithms to be able to do self-driving? Is it owned by the network that provides you access to it? I don't know.
So we have a couple of microphones down here in the front. So at this point, let me invite members of the audience and come pose questions to myself or to the panel. I've got one more question for Chris while we get going. Let me also mention, for those of you that are really interested, again, the book is out in the lobby, and there's also a course offered by the same title for any of you that are interested in these kinds of things. I think it will be offered through edX or something like that, but there's a course available on this as well. So while I was going to ask Chris one more question, then I'm going to bring them to the audience. In the labor, contract employees or contractors or employees, and how does that affect your platform business model?
Yeah, so obviously this is a pretty large question that's touched a lot of the on-demand economy, us in particular, and has been very public. We pretty firmly believe that within the way that the law is currently written, our relationship with drivers is pretty clearly in the independent contractor camp. And when we survey most of our drivers, the number one reason that people like partnering with us is that it is flexible. It's a really interesting thing. Like, you tap your phone and get a ride on demand, but if you actually ask a driver, they tap their phone and they can go make money on demand. They have no schedule, they can get on and off whenever they want. And for people who, the average American, if you're making, $45,000, $50,000 a year, the ability to make an extra $5,000 a year in your spare time is a 10% income increase. That's a very big deal. It's credit cards paid down, it's a vacation, it's education for your children. And so we believe that providing that flexibility for people is a really important thing. And so, yeah.
That sounds great. Let's take some from the audience, please.
Peter Vanderman with Flatiron Strategies. We're used to sort of seeing the transition of, say, if you will, legacy high-tech companies go through some of these transformations. Case in point, it took Wall Street a couple of years to sort of get its head around the fact that Microsoft moved from selling software licenses to the fact that it had a different revenue recognition model with its platform in the cloud as a service. and also get its head around the data ownership, the data privacy. Microsoft has gone through its own learning curves in that regard. But we don't seem to be as well aware that these same sort of transitions are now hitting other companies. So case in point, Michelin is now selling commercial tires as a service, IoT enabled. And they're going to go through that same sort of revenue recognition transition that Microsoft did, as well as a data ownership aspect of, oh my God, Rio Tinto's use of Michelin tires at all of their mines gives Michelin exposure and knowledge of what is being produced at those mines, maybe even at a faster rate than Rio Tinto does. I wish you could comment on these aspects that we need to see that this is happening, not just in the high-tech industry, but in our legacy industries as well.
So, a specific question for a panelist? You want to pick up?
I mean, I can offer a quick comment and response, and then, of course, open to the rest of the panel. I think, yeah, the as-a-service model, as I mentioned, I think is really pervasive. It's been coming for a while, but in our business, we often respond to requests from our clients, and I'm in our software business, but I've been increasingly working across a whole host of industries, and usually the initial request comes like, how would you advise us on becoming a software-enabled business? That's typically the way platforms actually come second. Very often they're looking at delivering something as a service, and they realize that they need software to enable that. I think it was Mark Andreessen that said software's eating the world, right?
Yes. Yeah,
so you're seeing that in literally every industry. I mean, I like one of my partners made a comment that they were talking about John Deere, and everybody thinks they sell equipment and tractors. But they don't. They describe themselves as being in the yield improvement business, right? And so providing a whole plethora of services to their customers in addition to the equipment that they provide, they've been doing that for years, right? So I mean, revenue recognition, not recognizing up front and spreading it out over the term of the service, for sure, but it's much more prevalent across the whole length and breadth of the business.
I would just add to that. I mean, I think a lot of it's a function of the way that consumers are buying too. I mean, even to your example with Michelin, right? I mean, Amazon has done a really good job of creating this world where all you have to do is press a button on your smartphone and the item shows up at your door the next day. There are applications, you take it down to like the food service industries or even beverage sales as an example. There are applications where all of that has now become a service and that's delivered to you instead of you going to it. I mean, so I think a lot of it's also a function of the way people consume and the requirements around that. And it's not that people are lazy. I think it's just a function of, maximizing your time, maximizing your productivity. So I think it's a model that more companies at the regular service level should consider.
I also think you point out.
I think we might want to we have time for one more question. We're going to run out of time on this. So we'll give
Okay, so I have one question. My name is Sudhir Desai. I call my company Living Enterprise. So I was curious, you use the term there. So I have two questions. One is the platform the logical end state in the sense that, we had value shops and then value chains and then value networks, and now we have value ecosystems. Is this the end state, or would there possibly be, further evolution of this? But more practically, in terms of, you talked about ways to manage a network or ways to manage an ecosystem. Do you see things like an emergent complex system kind of phenomenon? And would you use techniques like that to manage the ecosystem?
Well, I think it's going to change. Not because I have any idea where it's going to change, but because we know that everything else has changed. And as far as complex systems are concerned, it's a field I've worked in, and they tend to work backwards once you know what the answer is. I suppose you could list out all the combinatoric possibilities in the future, and to my earlier point and to your question, they exist. But I haven't found them very predictive because they don't have the discernment to say that's going to work and that won't. So I'm convinced that something new and something interesting is going to happen. And actually, the other thing I'll say is that as we invent new designs, financial models change, the business models change, the use models change, the regulations got to change, policies got to change, privacy's got to change, value appropriation's going to change. Michelin's value appropriating from Rio Tinto.
Yeah.
So,
I'm going to offer one complimentary opinion, which is I actually think this is going to be an end state for a little while. And the reason is I think, as there was opinions earlier, there's likely to be market concentration because these demand economies of scale lead to only a few large firms at the top. There aren't going to be too many, there's not going to be room for too many Ubers. There's not going to be room for too many Samsung operating systems. So I tend to think these are going to be stable for a while. So I think we're going to see some end states with this for a little bit. I think we're at time. So with that, I'm very happy to thank the panel for some extraordinary insights.